Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the McKeen's Hockey Show. My name's Kyle Watson. Today I'm joined by our Director of Scouting, Brock Otten, and our Assistant Director of Scouting, Derek Newmeyer, because we've got a new list, a new draft rankings list at McKeen's Hockey, our mid-season top 64. Guys, let's start right at the top. There's no change. Number one, still Gavin McKenna, but Ivar Stenberg has moved from third to second on our rankings. And I'm curious, do you guys see that as a race for first overall?
Yeah, Derek, you want me to go
off.
first on this one? All right.
Sure.
Yeah, I think when we sort of gathered the thoughts of our team, it wasn't unanimous to have McKenna still at number one. You know, Stenberg has had a really, really good year, both internationally and in league play, and he has a lot of projectable tools. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to the fact that the majority of our team still feels that McKenna has the highest upside of any player in this class. And it's a class that, maybe doesn't have somebody that you would call a true sort of annual award merchant, if you will, somebody who's going to be one of the best players in the NHL. I think you're looking at a lot of guys that are going to be really good NHL players, and McKenna fits in that. But I think that McKenna, especially when you look at his production lately and sort of how he's adjusting to the NCAA level, he's been really good post World Juniors. The competitiveness has increased, or at least been more consistent anyway. Production has increased. This is going to be a dogfight, and that's not sort of taking into account the fact that there's probably going to be some NHL teams that have one of the defenders ahead of both of these guys, because they also have some really projectable tools. So while for our team, it was sort of like a 1-2 race between McKenna and Stenberg, I think for the NHL and NHL staffs heading into June, I think it's probably more likely to be a 5 or 6 person race. How Verhoeff, Reed, Smits, those guys finish out the year as well.
Yeah, it's fair to say that the race has certainly tightened. I'd say the gap is certainly closed. But at the end of the day, at least for me, McKenna just has a dynamic element to his skill set that Stenberg doesn't quite have. Same thing with Verhoeff. Reed is having a great season, has some dynamic ability offensively, but he's still a little bit of an unknown. He kind of burst onto the scene late last year, so we're looking to see a little bit more of a resume out of him. But he's right in there for sure. I mean, there's probably a lot of teams that have Reed as the number one defenseman. That wouldn't surprise me. With McKenna too, I mean, he just has so much skill. And you look at what he needs to improve in his game. There's been a lot of talk about his intensity and his drive and his physical play. And those are things that are fixable to a degree. I mean, McKenna's never going to be a power forward. He doesn't have the frame for it. He doesn't really have the mentality. But it's not going to be hard for him to get better at improving his work rate and his defensive engagement. He's never going to be a top two-way player, but the deficiencies in his game right now, the big things, are improvable. And I think he's smart enough and committed enough to put in the work that he needs to do in his game. And like Brock said, he's already made some of that progress since the World Juniors. The offense is still there. It's picking up again as he's gotten more used to play at the NCAA level. So when you just look at the big picture and try and project these guys long term, I still think there's a chance that McKenna becomes a very, very high-end offensive contributor at the NHL level. Someone in that Nikita Kucherov maybe, or Artemi Panarin level, where there are some ups and downs in their game. There's some parts of the game that could be better, but there's so much puck skill, so much offensive creativity, so much lethality on the power play that other players just can't come close to. And I think that's probably what puts McKenna overall at the top for us. There's just something very, very special and rare about what he can do that you don't quite see in the guys right behind him. But there's still a lot of time left in this race to the draft in June. So things could still change. But for now, I think it makes sense to have McKenna still as our number one.
Brock, you mentioned that it was split. We had some votes for Stenberg. I'm interested, what were the people that were advocating for Stenberg at one saying, and did anybody have any other names at 1 or 2?
Well, the argument for Stenberg has more to do with maybe people being a little bit less certain on McKenna. At least that was sort of the feedback that we got from our staff, right? People were concerned about McKenna's off puck play, his ability to get to the inside at the NHL level, sort of that projection, whereas Stenberg doesn't have some of those same concerns. I think it's a tough word to throw around, but Stenberg is such a safe bet to be a high-end NHL contributor. Maybe not a safe bet to be a superstar, but a safe bet to be sort of a consistent 60-point guy who can play on your power play, who can be a really solid player. So there's value in that, obviously. And I know that some people on our staff were really, really impressed with him at the World Juniors and sort of how he improved over the course of that event as well. And he's obviously having a monumentally historic year in the SHL so far, right? So how he finishes the year there, that's going to really influence certain members of our staff, certain members of NHL staffs. So that's something to sort of watch moving forward as well. Yeah, and I mean, the defensemen too were definitely talked about. You look at a guy like Keaton Verhoeff. He's somebody that our staff seems very highly divided on. Pretty much any time he's brought up, we have a few people that just really are not as big of fans of his game. Maybe the rawness of his physical tools, and concerned that maybe some of those physical tools don't necessarily allow him to blossom into the type of player that meets his upside, if that makes sense. He's toolsy, but if those tools don't pan out, what do you have? Whereas you look at a guy like Carson Carrolls, who is just so solid. You look at a guy like Chase Reed, who's maybe a little bit more dynamic, definitely a better skater anyway. You've got Albert Smits, who has those similar tools that you can try to get the most out of, but he's probably a better skater as well. So yeah, you're looking at some detractors there. That's going to be I mean, it's sort of a different argument than what we started talking about here, but who we rank as the number one defenseman in June, or in our draft guide in May anyway, heading into June, that's going to be really interesting for us when we have those meetings, because I don't think that's necessarily set in stone. And I know the NHL community seems pretty set on Verhoff right now. Pretty much anything you read suggests that. But I don't think it's a closed book yet. I think that I don't know. I don't think you can necessarily go wrong. Like I think that some of these guys, I think that it's a good year to be at the team that needs a young defender inside the top 5 or 6, because that's where the true value of this draft class is finding that, potential top 2 defender, because there's a lot of them available. And I think there's going to be a variance of opinions on many of the top guys.
We're gonna get some interesting games out of some of these guys as well. Like Smits made the Latvian team for the Olympics. I mean, who knows if he'll play or play a lot, but he's gonna be there, and I think they'll give him a look. I certainly hope so. And then Verhoff is still eligible to play at the U18s in the spring. Chase Reed, unfortunately, is too old. Smits is too old. So those are going to be huge games for those two defensemen, Smits and Verhoff, to show what they can do. And it's not guaranteed to be a good thing for them. Like Verhoff did not have a great Halinka tournament, and that led into some of the concerns that people have about him. So pressure is going to be on him to be the best defenseman in that U18 tournament. And if he's not, that could that could be pretty bad for his draft stock.
Yeah, and some other defensemen like Chase Reed's going to have a good long playoff run in the Sioux. Daxon Rudolph and Prince Albert, they're looking like a good team, and same over in the Q with the Armada and Xavier Villeneuve. So I'm really excited to see how the rest of this draft class shapes out. I do want to ask you, I know we're always kind of hesitant to chalk in these hard tiers early on, but I do want to ask, it does seem like there's kind of a lottery range at least sort of forming, and there's a narrative I've seen on multiple rankings and lists that it is a pretty t strong top of the draft, and maybe that it's a stronger top of the draft than was once thought, maybe at the beginning of the year when people weren't so sold on McKenna and things were maybe kind of looking uncertain at the top.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely sort of a clear tier. I would sort of have it as like a top 11, top 12 right now. I think that there is some separation between that grouping and then the grouping after that. And then I think there's a lot of guys sort of in that like teens range. And then I would also kind of cut that off. And then you've got like 23, 22 into like the mid to early second round, where I think that there's a large group of guys that are very similar in terms of upside, similar in terms of projection, similar concerns. Um, Definitely some variance there, but that's sort of how I would kind of group it into sort of three tiers right now, sort of a top 11, top 12, depending where you have a guy like Ethan Belchet's, like us, or even like if you're considering Oscar Hemming to be part of that group, like us. And then you've got a next group which has some defensemen in it, like Lynn and Rudolph. And then you've got sort of that late first, early second grouping that has some risers that we're going to talk about in a second, like Wyatt Cullen, Alexander Command, for example.
You could even like thin it down a little bit more. I'd say we're getting close to like maybe a top five to a top seven with the players we've talked about. You maybe put Carson Carls in there, maybe Caleb Malhotra. Like I think like guys like Verhoeff and Reed and Smiths, they're going to be pretty high on everyone's list. And I think after the seventh pick or so, it starts to get a little bit more wide open. Some teams could have like an Oscar Hemming up there, or maybe even a Malte Gustafsson as a rangy defenseman who can skate. Maybe someone like a Ryan Lynn or a Daxon Rudolph. So I think it gets a little bit looser around there. And then throughout the teams, I'd say seems to be a lot of consensus. Seems like a lot of players are like on in that sort of range on a lot of different lists. Even with our list, I don't think we had a lot of debate or discussion about the guys we had in that 10-20 range. Like there was a lot of consensus as, yeah, these are the guys in that spot. Maybe they go up or down a little bit in that range, but I'd say from 10 to 20, it's starting to solidify. And really from 20 to 32, like we had a little bit of movement on our list. Some guys moved up, some guys moved down, which we're going to talk about. But there really wasn't a lot of debate this time around about which guys were going to make it into our first round.
I want to get onto the risers, but I just want to spend a second talking about Tynan Lawrence. Obviously, a unique situation. He's been injured most of the year, and now he's made the move to Boston University. Only a goal through 8 games. Brock, I'll start with you because I knew you're a big fan of him going into the season. Are you able to make any judgments based off his play in college so far, or do you think, you're going to give it some time here?
I think you have to be patient, but at the end of the day, you've got a guy like Oscar Hemming, whose production hasn't been elite since joining NCAA as well. But when you watch him play, he's impacting the game on so many different levels. And while he's not necessarily hitting the score sheet consistently, he's noticeable in ways that you want him to be. Whereas so far, Tynan Lawrence, hasn't necessarily been that way. I think he's kind of just been a guy, and I think that is a little bit concerning. I think you wanted him to be a little bit more impactful. Yes, he hasn't played a ton this year. And yes, I think the jump from the USHL to the NCAA is huge, especially mid-season. But at the end of the day, if this is somebody who's supposed to be the top center available in this class, he should be able to be a little bit more impactful than he has been. So I think you're sort of reserved in that judgment right now, but if there isn't growth in the next month and a half, I think you have to be asking yourself, what's the upside here? Was Lawrence sort of dominating the USHL because of how smart he is, and because I'm not going to say it, but the league has taken a bit of a hit. I'm not going to use another term to describe hit, is I do still have a ton of respect for that league and I love watching it. But at the end of the day, we're in the market of evaluating talent and evaluating performances. And so far in his short NCAA career, he's been a bit of a disappointment, especially when you contrast it to somebody like Caleb Malhotra, who just seems to be getting better and better and better every week, every month. Now he could end up leading the OHL in scoring by the end of the year. I mean, that's a very realistic thing that could happen with the way that he's playing on the team that he's playing for. So he's sort of making us reevaluate his upside, whereas Lawrence is doing it in a different way. Um, yeah, I think it's sort of like in the middle there. You want to sort of not make any concrete judgments based on such a small sample size, but I think it's okay to be somewhat disappointed on or from what we've seen from him at the NCAA level.
Yeah, it's really tricky because, like I said earlier with McKenna, you have to look at the overall book of play. Lawrence was fantastic in the USHL playoffs last year, the best 16-year-old in that league. So he's a guy who's been able to elevate his game at a high level and important moments. I thought he was really solid at the Holinka over the summer, even though the points didn't necessarily follow the way that his play would have suggested. But at the same time, he hasn't adjusted to the NCAA level as well as some others have. I mean, we talked about Hemming. Ilya Morozov is another one. He jumped from the USHL last year to the NCAA this year, and I found him to be more impactful overall. I've had a lot of really good viewings of him in that league. Even right away, like his first few games, I thought he was already leaving an impact. But at the same time, someone like McKenna took some time to adjust. And there was all these concerns about McKenna early on in the NCAA, and I think he's come a long way since then. So there's still a lot of time for Lawrence to find his game again and start learning how to make an impact at that level. But the results sometimes speak for themselves. You can wait, but you can't wait for too long with some of these guys. If there's no signs of progress, if his game seems to be stagnating, that can be pretty concerning. But like Verhoeff, who I mentioned earlier, Lawrence will get to play at the U18s this spring. He'll probably be the number one center for Canada, or maybe him and Malhotra will be one or two, depending on where the Bulldogs go in the playoffs. But he's going to get a lot of opportunities to really prove himself. He's going to get a lot of chances to, prove that he should still be one of the top players in this draft class, possibly even the top center. And, what happens now is kind of in his hands.
And I think another thing worth mentioning is, we're kind of evaluating him a little bit differently, right? Like Tynan Lawrence was supposed to be one of the more NHL ready players in this class in terms of the maturity in his game, the strength of his physical tools. This was a guy that was sort of being billed as such a well-rounded player who could impact the game on a variety of different ways, be a playoff performer, right? Kind of like how people viewed Caleb Denoyer last year, right? That was how we were viewing Tynan Lawrence. So if that's the way that we were supposed to be viewing him, the transition to the NCAA level, where a lot of those things are, they're something that are major assets. Shouldn't he have been a more impactful player? I guess that's the argument that you'd have, right? Like you would have thought Lawrence would have gone in and made an immediate impact. This is not like somebody who, like say Colin Potter last year, right? Sort of physically immature, high upside, definitely maybe not quite ready for the NCAA jump. Maybe there was some, risk involved there. This is a guy that, was supposed to be one of the more ready players in this class, and he's struggled to adapt to the NCAA level. So I guess that's, maybe a little bit more cause for concern based off of or compared to some other players. Look at Dean Letourneau, right? Last year, joined the NCAA probably earlier than he should have. Really struggled. This year, he's been fantastic, and the patience is paying off. That's a guy that you're okay with those struggles. Lawrence, again, probably should be more impactful than he has been.
We kind of alluded to some of these guys in our discussion about Lawrence, but let's move on to the risers. And Derek, I'll start with you and Oscar Hemming. He's the biggest riser in this particular set of rankings, up 23 spots to 11. But obviously, a lot of that's just because he found a home to play this year. So, what do you make of the whole situation, and how's he look to start?
Yeah, he's looked really good. I mean, this is a player that caught a lot of people's eye at the Holinka tournament, including mine. I mean, I thought he was one of the best players in that entire tournament. Looked like a guy who could be a top 10 pick just based off of his play there. But, you can never put too much stock into a single tournament. and then got caught in a really bad situation at the start of the year. He just couldn't find a place to play. His rights were being held by his Finnish club, and I don't know all the ins and outs, necessarily everything that went on behind the scenes, but they were very reluctant to let him play elsewhere, even though he wanted to. And we dropped him down our list a little bit just because he's not playing. He's not necessarily developing his game because he's not playing. He never wanted to put too much stock into one tournament, so we moved him a little bit lower on our last list. But he got to go in college, and he has really left an impact right away. Like his first game was really impressive, and he's looked right at home in the games since that I've watched. So it wasn't really hard for us to bump him up a lot on our list again, just because he looks like the same player that impressed us back over the summer. And he brings a unique kind of element in this draft class. He's got like power forward elements to his game. He's big, but he's skilled. He can play a little bit rough at times in the way that some of the bigger guys in this class or at the top of this draft class kind of don't. Someone like a Ryan Rubrick has size, but he's not physical. Hemming gets his hands dirty a little bit more, and there's just a lot of pro upside to him. He looks like the type of player that would be very, very valuable in a 7-game NHL playoff series. So I think there's a lot of appeal to Hemming in that regard. I'm still trying to suss out just how much pure offensive upside he has. Is it going to be a true first line top power play guy? Is he going to be more of like a secondary support scorer who also brings physical elements? I'm still trying to figure those things out, but yeah, I don't think anyone on our team had any hesitation about bumping him up our list quite a lot from the last rankings to these ones, just because he's the guy that we hoped we'd see once he came back. And if anything, he might even be a little bit better than we were expecting, just because of all the rust he had to shake off.
And Brock, I'll move on to Caleb Malhotra. Obviously, a guy in your region in the OHL. As you said, he could finish as the OHL's top scorer. Right now, I think he's tied for third. He's fitting right in with all that elite talent in Brantford. And what's impressed me is he's pretty much continued to hold down a spot on that first power play below the net. An effective 200-foot player. What have you made of him, and what's seen him go from 22nd in our pre-World Junior ranking all the way up to ninth?
Yeah, I mean, early on, I was a little bit iffy on the upside. I kind of saw him as maybe a bit of a clone of his father. A guy that clearly thought the game at a high level. Um, Definitely somebody who was going to play at the pro level, but I didn't necessarily see somebody who could take over games offensively. But sort of every month, he seems like he's improved a component of his game. His skating has gotten better. His pace of play has gotten better. He's showing more creativity and confidence with the puck. He's getting to the net. He's almost playing borderline like a power forward at times. There's just not much not to like about Caleb Malhotra's game at this point. And that's sort of what we want to see, right? In a draft year, you want to see somebody continue to improve week after week, month after month. And I think that's sort of why Malhotra has moved to the top of the center class for Derek and I personally. He was somebody that the two of us, I think, kind of wanted to rank even higher than we had him. But going back to sort of what we talked about with Lawrence, there was a lot of people on our staff that just wanted to be a little bit more patient with him, given sort of the previous performances that he's shown us. So I think that he's somebody, at the end of the day, when we rank in May for our draft guide, heading into June, I think he's somebody that could easily push for our top 5 or 6. I think he's just going to keep getting better. I would expect him to have a really strong playoff performance for Brantford. I expect Brantford to be in at least the Eastern Conference final, if not the actual OHL final. And I think he'll be right in the center of that.
Moving on to a couple of guys that weren't ranked in our last rankings that have moved into the late first round. Derek, I'll start with you. And Alexander Command, playing in the J20 National. He leads the whole league among draft eligible skaters with 38 points and 25 games. A player that's been kind of ever present for Sweden at previous national levels. What's put him up in our rankings?
He is a menace, and I say that in the most complimentary of ways. He's just a really well-rounded center who brings a physical element to his game. He really is competitive. He doesn't back down from challenges. He throws a lot of hits. He's not the biggest or strongest of guys, but he is really engaged physically. He's very active on the forecheck. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty. He finds ways to get to the net. He's also got a decent amount of skill. Like he's a good skater, he's a good puck handler, he's a good shooter. I don't know if any of those traits of his are necessarily super high end, but you just look at his game and the way that he impacts play for his team, and he does a little bit of everything. I don't really see any notable weaknesses to how he plays and what he brings. I just see a guy with a good amount of pro upside and a lot of different pathways where his game could go. Maybe he ends up being a second line center and a power play contributor. I think that's a realistic possibility. But if that doesn't quite work out, he's got a pretty good B game he could fall back on as more like a bottom six defensive center and a checker and an energy guy and maybe a bit of a pest. So that's certainly an advantage for him. He's been very good internationally this year for Sweden. He's been great at like the U18 tournaments, the World Junior A Challenge. He was really great for Sweden. So he just keeps getting better and better. And there's been a lot of talk about this draft class being a little bit weak down the middle, not just at the high end, but throughout the first round. So him, just as one of the few centers who has interesting upside, it just made a lot of sense for us to move him up our list. And it seems like, or at least I would be under the assumption that a lot of NHL teams would be very interested in him as well, because he's a guy with potential upside. He's pretty safe, and he's a center in a draft class that's a little bit weak on them. So I also wouldn't be surprised if he continues to move up our rankings. He could be a guy who finishes, around in like that 15 to 20 range if he continues to have a strong second half of his year and maybe impresses people at the U18s.
And Brock, I wanted to ask you about Wyatt Cullen, the son of former NHLer Matt Cullen, who won a couple cups with the Penguins. He's coming in at 22nd on our list this time. You were mentioning that he's dealt with some injury problems. Not a player I'm too familiar with, so could you maybe walk me through his season so far and how he shut up our list?
Yeah, he missed a lot of games at the beginning of the year. He was out for an extended period of time in October, out for an extended period of time in December. Really hasn't played a ton, which is obviously concerning. But at the end of the day, when he has played, he's been the development program's best player, in my opinion, by a country mile. And you look at the bloodlines there with his father being Matt. You look at the fact that he's one of the youngest players available in this class, which I think happens to explain some of the injuries issues that he's had and just needs to mature physically. But you've also got a guy that's a very well-rounded player on the wing. Good skater, committed two-way player, smart player, equal parts playmaker, goal scorer. He's kind of got it all. And I think that he's kind of flying under the radar based on, how little he actually has played. I think if he had played a lot more and didn't miss a ton of time, I think he would be higher on a lot of people's list, including ours. So I think he's somebody, as long as he can stay healthy, he's probably going to have a really good U18s. He's going to have a good end of the year. And I think he's somebody that could really shoot up further on lists just by staying healthy and based on sort of some untapped potential. Kind of like Derek was just talking about with Command, right? Like there's a safe floor here because Cullen is a smart player and he skates well and he's got a well-rounded skill set. But based on the fact that he is one of the youngest available, what's going to happen when he matures physically, right? Like how much further can his game grow? That's something that Derek and I sort of always focus in on. I saw Derek mention Beckett Seneca online the other day, and why he was a great find by the Ducks. As they shocked the world taking him as early as they did, right? And that's because they weren't drafting him for the player that he was. They were drafting him based on the upside that his physical tools presented, right? And when you look at some of these later birthdays, these guys that are younger, they're almost a full year younger than some players. Like Cullen is almost a full year younger than a guy like Ryan Rubrick or Adam Novotny. There's so much more growth available to him. I don't think we necessarily know the kind of offensive upside he possesses, but what we do see is a player that does have a well-rounded skill set that is driving play for the U18 American team when he is on the ice. So I think we need to take that into account.
Yeah, and do you think that, there's kind of room for him to take that team and make it his own? It's not really a year where there's any sort of superstar names that are kind of stealing ice time or anything, although they kind of give everyone ice time in the development program.
Yeah, and that's another reason why the development guys always sort of shoot up lists towards the end of the year, right? Because as we get closer to the U18s, that's when that ice time starts to be restricted. That's when, the coaching staff really starts to look at, okay, who are our core players? Who are we going to rely on? You always see the switch where they call up, some guys from the U17 program, send a few U18 guys down that are underperforming. You'll probably see that relatively soon. There'll be even more switches, I would imagine, going into the U18s where they look to take on some players playing out of the CHL because it is a bit of a down year for the program, as you mentioned. And there's some guys that could be available to them that were standouts for a really good Halinka US team that kind of shocked the world too, right? So like you said, I think there's a lot of room for him to stand out further as people start paying a little bit more attention to that team. Because right now, based on their performance so far this year, they haven't been. And because there's not a standout player, there isn't, a Jack Eichel on that team. Um, he's flying under the radar a little bit.
Well, that's all the time we have for you today. Make sure to check out our top 32 rankings available on our website. Top 64 and honorable mentions are available for subscribers, and we've got full in-depth scouting reports on many of the top prospects for the draft class available at mckeenshockey.com. Brock, Derek, is there any work you guys want to promote?
I mean, you just said it all, really, Kyle.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning to people that this is the start of this sort of like our scouting report season. You're going to start to see way more
Mhm.
in-depth reports coming out. As of recording this right now, the only ones that have been published are Chase Reed and Gavin McKenna, but there have been some other ones submitted. Albert Smiths will be probably coming out this week, and you'll start to see more over the coming weeks. We've also begun work on the McKeen's annual prospect report, where we rank and talk about the top NHL affiliated prospects. That'll be a top 200 list with team by team rankings, organizational rankings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Always a hot topic for people to debate. So that will probably be coming out in maybe late March, if I were to guess. We've got the list sort of pared down at this point, and then people have to work on it, and it's got to hit the publisher and everything, graphics team. So that'll probably be sometime in March.
Lots of stuff to keep an eye on. Make sure to stay tuned to our social channels and everything. And yeah, guys, I'm excited to talk to you again soon. The season's just ramping up. The important games, the playoffs, the tournaments are here to come. So thanks for coming on and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.